Hi there, Grand Design owners. Today in your 2015 Grand Design Momentum, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install Roadmaster's Comfort Ride slipper spring system for triple axles. And this is what our slipper spring boxes look like when they're installed. We've got the full triple axle kit installed. The back section here is set up very similar to like a tandem axle, and then this is the extra portion here that allows it to work with your third axle. Both of our slipper sections here at the rear allow it to move freely inside of this slipper spring box, and then the one here towards the front has the slipper section here for the front axle. And this allows each axle to be completely independent from one another. So what this means is that when you hit a bump, let's say if you hit a pothole or a speed bump, when this tire hits, this axle is going to move up and then it's going to drop back down. It's not going to affect this one at all. This one then is going to hit, it's going to go up and come back down. Your traditional equalizer system, when this one were to move up, your equalizer that's here pivoting in the middle, this would want to go up and then it would push this axle down. And that would transfer more of that impact into the frame and into your trailer, giving you a much rougher ride, causing your cabinets to probably vibrate and open. It just puts a lot more stress on the frame and everything else on your trailer. Upgrading to something like this is going to not only save your interior components like your dishes, cabinets, and things like that from rattling around, it's also going to help just extend the life of your entire trailer, because all those road impacts over time, metal fatigue is a thing and things can wear out and break. So let's just minimize all those impacts and make everything last longer. Here we hopped underneath so we can take a look here at the inside. This kit also includes shock absorbers for each axle. So we've got completely independent leaf springs now, and we've got dampening from our shock absorber here to help absorb those impacts from the road. This is going to further reduce all of the rattles and movement that we've got in the trailer by absorbing those impacts. It's going to again further extend the life of our system. And it's just going to make the trailer ride a whole lot better behind us. It's going to help reduce sway and chucking and pretty much everything, because this is just such a better suspension system. This is going to be a lot more like you would kind of have at the back of a truck with a leaf spring and a shock absorber. And this, the axle here, you only have one axle on a truck, so it's just doing its one thing. On a trailer, usually your axles are affecting the other ones and transferring forces back and forth. This is going to keep everything independent and moving very smoothly. Included in your kit, you're going to get 2 slipper spring boxes and 3 leaf springs for each side, as well as shock absorbers for each axle for each side. You'll also get all of the hardware that's necessary to get this installed. So if you want to follow along with us, we'll show you how to get your old components off and get your new Comfort Ride system on. And as a little bonus on this one, if you have Lippert's True Track system on your trailer already, our customer had that installed on this one. It's something normally you don't have to deal with, but it does affect the installation of the Comfort Ride. They do clash a little bit with one another. So you can use this video as a reference if you've got this at home, so you can figure out how we took this this True Track system that's on here and adapted it to allow these to work as well. We'll begin our installation by first lifting up the vehicle so that way our wheels are off the ground. You can do this a couple of different ways. You can use your leveling jacks to lift it up until they come off the ground. You may have to place some blocks or something underneath, maybe like a cinder block or a big block of wood to help get it up high enough to get them off the ground. You could also place a floor jack underneath the frame and jack it up and then put your stands underneath. If you do use your leveling jacks to lift it up, you'll want to make sure that you do put jack stands underneath the frame afterwards, because we don't want to trust just hydraulics holding the weight of our trailer up above us while we're working. We want to make sure we've got something that is going to lock it and hold it in place. So a jack stand will ensure you've got contact between the ground and your frame. So I highly recommend that. Once we've got it up here, we've gone ahead and lifted it up. We've got it all supported. So now we can go ahead and get our wheels off. We're going to use a 19mm socket to remove the lug nuts. So we'll just get all these off. We'll take each one and get each one removed. And we'll just get each one of these off of here now. Now, if you don't have an impact like this at home, and you're going to be taking these off by hand, what you would want to do is first crack each one of these nuts loose while your trailer is on the ground. And you're not taking them off, you're just going to only turn it maybe one turn just to get it loose and then lift it up, and then you can get them off by hand. If you try to take these off while they're still fully tight, while it's in the air, the wheel's just gonna wanna spin on you when you're trying to take them off. And after you got all the lug nuts removed, the wheel will just lift off. And we're just gonna roll it out of the way here and get the other two removed. Next, we're gonna start putting our jack stands in place and taking our hardware loose here so we can drop the axle down to get those leaf springs and our hangers and stuff like that out of the way so we can get our new slippers in place. So we need to make sure we support our axles, especially if you've got like an electric over hydraulic setup like this. You don't wanna stress your brake hose here. So we wanna make sure we are supporting these axles so it doesn't come down too far and damage any of our components. Also, if you have electric brakes, you're gonna have wires there as well, so you wanna try not to stress those either. So we're just pushing it in. We are gonna go kind of far back in there a little bit to support it, because I like to have a way to get my jack underneath here. So I like to put the jack kind of underneath the U-bolt area, so I know if I'm lifting up, I'm not gonna bend the axle if I'm lifting from that location. So our support we can put maybe about right there. That way we know we've got room for our jack to get in there. We'll repeat that for the remaining axles. These ones I can put a little bit closer, because this is kind of a combination jack and jack stand all in one. So this will do both of our needs. So now we've got our jacks in place, we can start taking our hardware loose. Now normally what I like to do is I like to completely remove one side and then get one side completely installed and then do the other side after that. Now with this particular trailer here, we're gonna have to do it a little bit differently because of the components that are currently on this trailer. So if we look at our suspension here, it's already got Equiflex equalizers on it, not your traditional equalizer. And if we look at the hanger in the back here, it's got Lippert's True Track. Now this is where our issue is with the True Track. Now our slipper spring boxes, when we go to put those in place, they won't be able to slide over a hanger that is like this, where it has these ears that come out. That's to hold the cam in place here for the True Track, for adjusting your axle forward or backward a little bit if you need to make that adjustment. So here we pan back to our equalizers. We've got the one towards the rear and the one kind of towards the front middle area. The one at the rear here has a traditional hanger. Our slipper spring box is gonna work great. It's gonna slide over this. We're not gonna have any issues. Your front and your rear hangers that we were looking at a minute ago and your leaf springs really could stay because there's no slipper box that's going there. You just need to be aware that the bolts here are gonna be extra long to accommodate for these parts, and these are wet bolts that are installed in there, so you'd have to change your bushings to bronze bushings to match the wet bolt. You don't want to leave the bushings that come with your slipper spring kits in place if you're using these, because they have plastic kind of never fail bushings. They're self-lubricating, and the lubrication that you would actually put in these wet bolts can damage that type of bushing. So you can see here our equalizer here towards the front has that adjustment slot there. The back one here, not an issue. This one's got that regular traditional hanger. We slide up, no big deal. This front one here though has got that ear that's gonna interrupt us, and this is where our problem is. Because since we're gonna have these completely supported, these hoses and hangers and things like that we were talking about not letting them drop too low is a little bit riskier because it's just being supported by our jack stands, and if we've got pretty busy shop here, somebody comes by, they could bump this, and I don't know what your garage is like at home, you could have a similar scenario if it's real busy around there. That's why if you do one side at a time, you're safer because it's bolted on the other side. There's no way for this to kind of fall out of here. So now we're underneath the trailer. We're looking from the inside at the back of the front equalizer. This is the one towards the front. This one here, you can see this is our spring eye is attached to it there. We've got shackles here, and then we've also got our bolt here that connects our equalizer to the hanger. We're gonna be taking these off for all of these components on this entire side. So you're gonna have multiple shackle bolts, multiple equalizer hanger bolts, and as well as your leaf spring eye bolts. To remove these, we're gonna use an 11/16 socket to hold or to take the nut off. And then the other side here, normally the splines hold it so you don't need a wrench, but sometimes those splines wear out and you do have to put a wrench on here, and we'll use a 13/16 wrench for there if we need to, if it spins. And right away, right out the gate, that one spun, so those splines are no good, so we're gonna have to put a wrench on that side. And we're gonna leave the bolt in there for now. We're just gonna get the nuts removed off of each of these, because as long as the bolt's in there, it's gonna keep our suspension kind of still supported. Another thing I did do though is I made sure that my jack stand was touching the bottom on each of my axles. If I was lifting up on the jack and there was a little gap there, I would take my floor jack and I'd raise the axle up just a little bit so I could pull my jack stand up to the next click and then drop the axle down on it, because I don't want things moving around while I got my hands in here. If the axle shifts a little bit, you can get a pinch and get a pretty good blood blister or something from that. So it's nice to have all your components supported so that way nothing moves. So we're just going to continue on now and remove all these until all the nuts are removed on this side. So now that the nuts are removed from all the hardware here, we can start taking our components off. Again, double check yourself, make sure that those axles are supported by your jack stands, because once we take these loose, things are going to want to start to shift a little bit here. So now we'll go ahead and get these out. Now we got our hammer here because they're probably fairly loose. That one just slid right out of there. Some of them are going to be in a little bit of a bind though, and you might have to tap them out. What I always like to do if I'm tapping them out is I like to take a nut and just thread it on there. And what this really does for me is when I'm hammering this out, if I happen to hit a little bit too hard on the end of the bolt here, it can mushroom the head and space it out, and then I'm fighting that mushroomed enlarged area trying to get it through the hole. This will keep you from mushrooming the bolt. You're just going to mushroom the nut that we can just unscrew. In a lot of cases, once you get it started and get it moving like that, it taps out a lot easier after that initial drive. And you can see it's already nice and loose. We can just pull it out of there at this point. These upper ones, wherever they come down into the hanger here, these ones you're definitely going to want to put that nut on there. This is going to do two things for you on these, because these ones are going to be in here pretty stiff, so it's going to prevent it from mushrooming like we talked about down there, but it's also going to keep you from, if you do get this bolt to drive, it may just shoot out of there and then your equalizer falls on top of you, so it's going to prevent that from shooting out on you as well. There we go, we got it to budge. Usually taps out much easier from there, so we can go ahead and take that off now. Baby tap, look at that, came right out. So now we're just going to repeat this working down, or we'll get our leaf ones next. We're going to do the same trick where we put the nut on it and drive it out, and do the same at the front and our other equalizer as well there. So we'll get all these hardware out of the way. So now that we've got those out of the way, we went ahead and contacted Roadmaster to get some more information on these hangers, and they did indicate that we don't have to replace the entire hanger with the traditional style. They said that we can take just this ear here and we can just grind these ears off, and that will be acceptable. So since Roadmaster said it's okay, here we go. We're just going to cut these ears off. We only need to do this on the hanger that's behind the front axle. We don't need to do it to the very front hanger or the very rear hanger, and the one that's behind the second axle is already correct, so we don't need to modify that one. So this is just this one here. We're going to do it on this side, and we're going to repeat it over on the other side for the same hanger. We'll be cutting off all 4 ears, so both on this side and both on the inside here as well. Next, we can get our leaf springs removed from here. Now, one of the things I did do, we got a piece of wood that we just put right here. This isn't anything that's kind of necessary. This is just to keep our axle kind of supported on our jack stands. It wants to kind of roll a little bit, so the spring here is going to keep that from rolling. Once we get the spring off of there, it'll settle down inside of our kind of the V shape, and it won't want to cock so much. So if you got one that really wants to pull and it's kind of putting a little bit of pressure on any hoses or wires, you can put something in place to just kind of hold it back a little bit so it doesn't do that. Now we'll get our U-bolts removed. Now we do want to look at something real quick here on our U-bolts before we take them off. Quick inspection. We need to make sure we've got a good 2 to 3 threads plus sticking off the top of our U-bolt there. If we don't, and it's kind of like flush with the top of the nut here, and only got like 1 thread sticking up, then you would want to purchase slightly longer U-bolts, which you could get here at eTrailer. These ones here look like we got enough extra thread sticking through, because our new plate that we put on top of the new leaf springs is a little bit thicker than the factory plate here, so you're going to need an extra thread or 2 in order to get that fully tightened. So we're good to go here, so we can go ahead and get these off. The nuts on here are going to be a 22 millimeter, so we're just going to put our socket on there and zip these right off of there. And that top one there, sometimes you just can't quite get your gun into every single one because of the tight clearances. But usually once you get the majority of them broke loose there, this last one is significantly easier to get the nut off of there. And look at that, hardly any pressure, because we've kind of already released most of the pressure on it there. We're really more, if anything, just kind of breaking the dirt loose from the threads. So now we'll just get all this off of here. So since we are going to be reusing these, make sure you save your nuts and any hardware that's on here. We got washers below it, so we're going to make sure we transfer all that over with our U-bolts to the new components. And I'm going to grab the axle here before taking this last one loose. Since this particular axle kind of wants to roll a little bit, we want to make sure we're kind of supporting it here just to make sure it doesn't fall off of our stands. It shouldn't, because of that V shape on your stands. It should kind of help hold it in there. But if you can just kind of support it just a little bit to reduce the momentum as it's moving, things will go a little bit smoother. So we've got all those off. The U-bolts, it's pretty normal for those to kind of want to spread a little bit after they've been on there for a while, and that makes them real hard to get out of here. But we can just take and lightly tap these to get these out of here. And I'm not tapping very hard at all. This is like a little baby tap. So I'm not worried about mushrooming the head on these because I'm tapping it with such a light amount of pressure. And there we go. We can now take the top off. We won't be reusing the top plate here. You're going to have new ones that come in your kit. That will allow us to attach a shock absorber to it. And then our leaf here, we can go ahead and just lift off. We had that little support there. We're just going to move out of the way, kind of curve our leaf around our wiring or our hose there, and then set that aside. And now we're just going to repeat this for the remaining two axles on this side. Once we get these completely disassembled at that point, we're going to be swapping out those hangers, getting those new ones welded on there, and then we can go back together. If you're doing this at home, I would recommend just getting this side back together if you don't have to do that, and then doing your other side. But if you're in the same boat as us, you can go ahead and get the other side disassembled while you're waiting for the welder to come out to fix your hangers there. So now that we've got all of our old suspension components removed, we can start putting our comfort ride system into place. So this is our slipper spring box here. We're going to have two of these because we have 3 axles. So these are going to go in between the axles. So you're going to have it between your front and your middle, in between your middle and your rear. They're going to hang on the hangers here. So we had cut those off. We went ahead and put some black spray paint on those to cover up those ears because they had a True Track system on here. We did speak with Roadmaster and they said the slot here is okay. It's not going to affect our system because we bolt it to the frame there. So we don't have to worry about that. The only thing we do need to make sure we do is that we center this piece in the center of this piece when we install it. So we're going to be doing that, but the first step is we need to make sure that the top of this here is going to be flush with the bottom of the frame. So we've got some stuff hanging down here, a couple of self-tappers that are holding that underbelly up. We'll need to get that out of the way. So the way I like to do that first is we're just going to mark it. So we're just going to take our spring box here, then we're going to raise the spring box up, get it relatively centered there, and then we're just going to take our razor knife on the outside, going just past the slipper spring box, and we're just cutting it just like that. So now that we've got it marked on how wide we need it to be trimmed out, we can start removing this material. So I'm just going to make sure I have that all the way cut. And then we've got our other cut here. We're just going to take this cut and then going along the inside of the frame rail, trimming this out all the way till we reach our other cut. Now you also may have some self-tappers in place. It's pretty normal to keep this underbelly up. So we've got one here, and there's one around the other side of the spring hanger there. We're going to use a 10mm socket for these. Sometimes it's an 8mm socket. Once we get both of these screws removed, we should be able to take the piece that we just cut and pull that out of there. Looks like we need to trim just a little bit more. And additionally, with the pad here, check the kind of the back side. Right here you can see some of it. Usually they put some silicone there just to help further seal that up. We need to just get all that gunk out of there so our slipper spring box has good contact with the bottom of the frame. So I'm just taking my razor knife and just kind of cleaning that up. You don't need to get 100% of it off, just the majority of it so that way it'll sit flush. So now we've got that trimmed out. It's not a bad idea to just take your slipper spring box one more time and just push it up on the bottom there. Make sure it gets up against the bottom of the frame, and we can see straight through the attachment hole there. So that looks good. Now we'll need to get a spacer in place before we attach the spring. This is going to ensure that when we tighten everything down, it doesn't collapse our hanger and our slipper spring box. Now this spacer here is going to be a really tight fit. It's very normal for it to be extremely tight. So to start, we're going to just spread these out just a little bit. Take our hammer here. Just give it a little bit of assistance. That's usually not quite enough. Oh, it looks like we're just about right there. That actually worked out kind of perfect. Usually you have to take your pry bar as well. It looks like we are going to have to just a little bit here. And just kind of put it in there and just get a little bit of a tug on it. And then line it up. Next, we're going to go ahead and find center. So we can make sure we've got this in the center. And let's see, up here at the top, it's three inches across, so we're going to mark it at that 1.5 in the middle. So we know that this is the middle of our hanger right here. We can also do the same thing down here, but where we kind of cut this, it's a little less reliable because we don't know these are perfectly smooth. So it's kind of better to go up on here on the top where it's got that machined edge where you didn't modify anything to make a mark. But it doesn't hurt to just double check yourself down here and see if everything kind of lines up. We're at about 3 3/8, so it gets a little complicated to do the math to find the center. But we've got the center up there, so that'll be fine. We'll then take our slipper spring box and we're going to lift this up into position. I like to use my knees to help me with this a little bit if I can, especially when you're trying to line it up like this. Looks like our mark needs to be a little bit taller. And then we'll measure now, double check ourselves, make sure that the mark we extended looks good. Still looking like it's right at 1.5 there. And then what I like to do is this distance here. If we measure this across, it's right at about 5.5 inches. So we're going to mark it at 2 3/4. So we know that that's center. Then we can just line these two up and we'll take our bolt and slide it through. So now we'll just take our bolt here. This is one of the larger ones that come in the kit. It did look like our spacer here, when we kind of held it up there, was a little bit offset. So we're just going to adjust it slightly over towards the front to get a little bit better center. We can then raise our slipper spring box up into position, slide our bolt through. We verify that both of our white marks there line up so we know we're in the center. And then we're just going to take that nylon locking nut and put it on the other side. We can go ahead and leave this loose for now. But if you wanted to, if you kind of have like we have here where it's kind of loose, we've got a bit of a gap there towards the top. It kind of makes your job easier for the next step if we use our legs to kind of push this up against the bottom of the frame and then just snug this bolt down a little bit, because that'll help prevent a gap from being here, which will allow our holes that we're going to drill out to be more precise. So to make our life easier here, we're just going to use our legs. Just kind of help lift that up, hold that into position. We're using a 21mm socket for the bolt head, and we're going to use a 22mm socket to hold our nut. It's usually a little bit easier if you just kind of get down under here. You can get a little bit better leverage pushing up on it. And then just double check your marks there, make sure they're lined up. If everything's good, we can proceed to drilling. If you need to adjust it, you might need to loosen it and shift it a little bit. In most cases though, if you don't have a true track, you're not gonna have to do this. If you just got a regular hanger with a single hole in it, it's gonna be lined up, so you don't have to worry about doing all that measurements and all these extra kind of little steps we're doing here. And now we're just gonna take a 21/64 drill bit and we're going to drill these out. There's one little minor check you want to do before you drill as well. I just run my thumb along the outside of it here and I feel for the lip of the frame on top. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side and just kind of feel if that lip's about the same. If it's not, you want to stick a big pry bar in here and maybe tweak your hanger a little bit. It may be a little bit bent. So just try to get that even front and back. We feel really good here. In most cases it feels good, but every now and then you got a tweaked hanger there that you got to kind of adjust. So then we'll just take our drill bit now. We're going to raise it right up here into the slipper spring box with our hole. I like to kind of skewer towards the outside edges of the holes to make sure that I don't hit the kind of center of our I-beam here. So we're kind of skewering a little bit towards the outside of that hole, and we're just going to drill straight on through it. Now that we've got it drilled out, we're going to take the self-tapping bolts that come in our kit. We are going to put some Loctite on it there, some thread locker. You can get this here at eTrailer if you need some. And then we'll use a 9/16 socket to run this self-tapper into the hole that we had just drilled. And then we're just going to repeat that 3 more times for the other one on this side and both of the other ones on the other side. And then we can go back and torque these to the specification outlined in your instructions. So now that we've got those torqued down, the center bolt here, we mainly put this in so we could hold this up against the frame to make it easier for drilling. There are some washers that should go on there. Really, we probably should have just put those on first, but we're going to loosen this up and slide those washers on there now. And you can see with our bolts holding everything in place, it makes it nice and easy. Tighten this guy down. We are still going to hold off on torquing it, and really you don't even need to tighten it down just yet if you don't want to, because we're going to wait until we get all the rest of our parts here and we'll tighten and torque everything down in our slipper box all at the same time. But if you're using it just to hold this up, it's okay to tighten it down now. Next, we're going to be getting one of our leafs in place. But on our leaf spring here, you can see here at the end of the eyelet, it has a regular kind of a plastic bushing. It's a never fail bushing. They're self-lubricating. So with this style of bushing, you actually don't want to use wet bolts, because if you put grease in there, the grease can actually deteriorate the bushing and then it can wear it out prematurely. So what you would normally want to do is take your wet bolts that you have and replace those with regular standard shackle bolts. We have those available here at eTrailer. With the True Track system the guys got on here though, we have it has an extremely long wet bolt to make this work, and we don't have, there are not standard bolts available to be able to get this installed with this here. It's an easy solution though, since we can't change the bolt to match the bushing, we'll change the bushing to match the bolt, and we'll reuse those bolts. So to get the bushing out of your spring, if you are doing the same thing as us here where you want to use wet bolts, you can drive these out. If you're not using wet bolts, you can skip ahead, and we're going to be putting it in a minute. We're going to get this bushing out of here since we are using the wet bolts. We're just using a socket here of similar and ever so slightly smaller size than the outer diameter of the bushing. Boom, just knock it right out like that. And then we're going to drop this down on the floor because the bronze bushings are a little bit more difficult to drive in. So now we just moved down to the floor. It's a little more solid than our table. Usually those, the ones that come in here drive out really easily, but these ones are going to be pretty solid going in. So you can see it starts there, but then it gets pretty solid real fast. We're going to use a slightly larger socket to do this, so it's got a bigger surface area, so that way it kind of covers both the inside and outside with an area so we don't mess up our bushing there. We're just going to set it on top right there and just drive it straight down. It should drive in fairly easily here on the ground, but if you were kind of driving in on a table like we were, it kind of wants to bounce around, so I really recommend going down to the ground for this one. And we're just trying to drive it in until it's flush.
Just kind of feel both sides. That feels pretty good right there. So if you're reusing wet bolts, you'll only need to do this to your very front and your very rear spring eye. So you'll need a set of 4 if you're doing a triple axle trailer and you want to maintain those wet bolts. You can get that here at eTrailer, and these are just the standard 9/16 bushings here. Next, we're going to take our leaf spring. We're going to be putting into position. This bolt and spacer here is going to end up in one of these positions here. We're going to temporarily just use the bolt to slide it in there. It makes it a little bit easier to hold your leaf spring up when you're messing around with it. So we're just picking really any of those holes and just sliding it through to give us a shoulder. We're then going to take our leaf spring and we're going to put the slipper side, which doesn't have the spring eye, put that right over our bolt. We can rest on it there. And now we'll just take this end and we're going to lift it up until it lines up in between our hanger here. So you can see here, since this is the True Track system, it's got a slotted hole there, so we do need to make sure we're using all the parts that come with the system there to make sure we hold it in the appropriate spot. So we've got our wet bolt here. We're going to start with one of the adjusters. We're going to raise our spring up, and then we're just going to line this up and slide it into place. Now, it's not uncommon for these to be a little stiff in here, especially if you're reusing some old hardware. Sometimes it can, depending on how you drove it out. And sometimes when you're putting these in place, they can just be a little bit of a fight. So you sometimes have to tap them into place. We're not going to be hitting it real hard. We're just tapping it to get it to kind of slide in there. Since it has a grease zerk here on the end, we're using a socket to ensure we don't hit on the zerk, just on the bolt. Now our octagon here, we're going to pull this back. We want this to be towards the top position because that's how it was when we disassembled it. And then when you get to the other side, it's not uncommon that you have to kind of angle your leaf spring up just a little bit to clear. We're going to be very careful here to try to tap it. We're trying to get the shoulder of the bolt through the slot on the other side. So that's why you got to angle it sometimes to get just that right position to get it through. Then we'll get her tapped all the way in there. Take our other adjuster, slide it into place. You need to make sure that these adjusters are in between the ears because that's what holds them in their position. And then we're just going to reuse our nut here to hold that in place. Now we're going to head back over to this side of the spring. We had just slid this bolt in here as a temporary holder. It does go in one of 2 positions. It'll either go in this top slot here or in this slot here. To determine which hole you'll want to use, you'll just slide the bolt in kind of like what we just did there. And then we just want to see that our leaf spring here is level with our frame front to back. If that slot makes your leaf spring level, then that's the slot you want to use. If it's tipped up a little too high, go down to the lower slot. If you're using the lower one, it's angled down, move it up. So now that we know which slot is going to be the appropriate one for our trailer, we can now properly assemble it. So what we're going to do to do that, we're going to actually take one of the bigger bolts here. We're going to lift up on our spring, and now we're going to use this one to temporarily hold our spring out of our way while we get this set up. This one here is going to slide through our slipper spring box, then it's going to slide into this spacer and then out the other side of the slipper spring box. It's not uncommon for the slipper spring box to be pretty stiff and difficult to get this in place. Let's see if we get lucky. Oh, look at that, we got lucky. This one here slid right in there, but if it is a little bit stiff, you can just take a little pry bar like this. They don't usually need much. You can stick it in there and just give a little bit of a pull, and that usually gives you just enough to be able to get that spacer up in there. Once we get our spacer into position, we're just going to take that bolt we had before, we're going to push it all the way through, and then take a nylon locking nut and put it on the other side. We don't want to fully secure it just yet, so just hand tight's good enough. We'll then lift up on the leaf spring. We're going to pull this bolt out, and we're going to drop this down. This bolt here is going to install very similarly in one of these 2 holes. If you chose the upper hole for the lower silver bolt here, then you're going to use the upper bolt hole here. If you chose the lower one, then you use the lower one. So we've got the upper one here. This is the spacer that goes in place between the slipper spring box, and it has a wear pad on it there. So we're just going to take this, kind of just sits right on top of the leaf spring. If you just push it in there, it almost lines up perfectly with that hole there for you. We can then slide our bolt all the way through, and then we're going to secure it on the other side with a nylon locking nut. Now at this point, I would recommend you repeat these exact same procedures here to get your slipper spring box and your leaf spring installed on the rear axle there. So this is kind of our middle front hanger. Next to your back, you're going to have your middle rear hanger, and then your leaf spring attaches to the back. It's almost exactly the same. You're just mirroring this portion here towards the front. It's going to be on the back for the other one going towards the rear. So here we have our rear one installed, mimicked, angled towards the rear. The rest of our focus is going to be here between the two slipper spring boxes. Things does change a little bit in there. Now we can go ahead and get our middle leaf in here. This one is going to be a little bit different. The bushing here, we're going to keep with the plastic one because we're going to attach it to our slipper spring box here using the hardware that it comes provided with. I've gone ahead on the slipper spring box towards the rear. I went ahead and put that same bolt in here with the little roller on it, same way that we did it with the other ones, and we chose the same location so that way everything's in line. That's just going to make it a little bit easier when putting this spring in place. So we're going to go ahead and lift our spring up into position now. That way we can kind of hook it on there, and then the other spot we can slide it up inside of here. So now we're going to attach it to one of these two holes. You're going to choose the hole that's the same as the wear pad that you've installed there. So that means we're going to be using the upper hole. But if you were using the lower set of holes on your other components, then you would want to choose the lower set there. There's going to be quite a bit of play here between the spring and the slipper box. We've got spacers that comes in the kit to take that up. These can be kind of tricky. This is, in my opinion, one of the more difficult parts that come in the kit to get together because it's pretty tight in there. We have to hold this thing up. That's why I chose to put the one bolt in here to help hold things up while we're trying to do this. And now we're going to go ahead and get these installed. I'm going to take a spacer, I'm going to put it in place. I'm going to slide the bolt through it just enough to hold the spacer on there. We should be able to then push the spring towards the opposite side, lift it up, and get it kind of line up with our bolt. There we go. And these plastic bushings, they are fairly stiff when they're new, so once you get that bolt started in there, you are going to have to tap it through. What we're wanting to pay attention to when we tap this bolt in though, we don't want to tap it too far to where the bolt sticks out the other side because that's going to make it really hard to get this spacer in place. So we just kind of want to get it started up inside of there, and then we're going to try to get this spacer in there now. And this is the one that can be a little tricky because of the tight clearance. Okay. All right, so we're going to try and feed this in. And now we'll take this other spacer here. This is going to slide up. It's not uncommon for this to be fairly stiff. You sometimes get lucky and you can slide it in there just like we did. If it's a little bit stiff, you can just take a little hammer and just a screwdriver to tap that into place. Now that we've got it roughly lined up, we're just going to tap it on home. And we're just tapping our bolt till it goes through the spacer we'd put in. Might have to adjust just a little bit here to get it to go all the way through the slipper box. So we're just kind of lifting up on the leaf spring to line it up with the hole. And now we're poking through the other side of the hole. We can just drive it on home. We'll then place a nylon lock nut on the other side. And then we're going to head over from here to the other side of our leaf spring so we can put those wear blocks in. And then here at the other side of the spring, everything is going to be the same as the other ones was on the non-spring eye side. You're going to put your spacer in place with the wear pad on it. Slide your bolt through and then finish it off with a nylon locking nut on the other side. At this point now, we've got all of our components for our slipper spring box and our leaf springs and everything attached together here. We just need to go back now and tighten and torque everything down. Using a 22 and a 21 for our larger ones here. We'll go ahead and switch to a 5/8 socket and wrench for the smaller hardware here. And then we can go back and torque these down to the specifications outlined in our instructions. And then we can go back and tighten down our shackle bolts on each side. And then we'll torque these as well to the manufacturer's specifications. At this point now, we're just going to be repeating the same process for all the hardware going down the line. We've hit each bolt, so just go back and put the appropriate torque to each one. So now that we've got all of our hardware torqued down here in the front, we're just going to repeat that same process for the rear section here to get those tightened and torqued down as well. We're now over at the vise because we're going to be putting our axles back up and attaching them to our leaf spring stacks. This is the top bracket that's going to allow us to attach a shock and also squeeze everything together. Here's our U-bolt, and if you look here, look at that. Just normally, when you take your U-bolts off, they stretch a little bit, and then it kind of causes them to expand. You can see it's kind of almost wide apart at the top there. So we're just going to take our vise here and squeeze it down so that way it fits appropriately, because you can get this in there without it by squeezing it yourself by hand, but that is a lot more effort. So we're just going to slide it in the vise, squeeze it, and what I'm looking at here is it's completely flush all the way down. We're going to squeeze it until we have a gap there, make that gap just a slight bit bigger, and then we're going to back it off. Now we're going to check our fit. And look at there, slides right in there. You do want to keep in mind that you want to check the further spaced holes. The ones that are close together, you're never going to squeeze this enough. That's not the right holes. It needs to be the ones that are spaced far apart. So now we'll head back to the vehicle and get these installed. Make sure you repeat this for each of your U-bolts so that way they all fit in your brackets. So now here back at our trailer, we can go ahead and start lifting our axle back up. We've got a jack underneath it, we can jack it up, little bottle jack style. Make sure that your jack plate here where it's raising it up doesn't obscure where your U-bolts go, because we need to be able to put those back into place. If we look at the bottom of our new leaf spring, we can see that there's a bolt head there. That needs to line up with the hole in the top of our leaf spring mounting position here on the axle. So we'll need to adjust it until we get it lined up. Looks like when we took some things loose, it kind of shifted back a little. No big deal. We can shift it forward to make it line up. Okay, let's try that. Go up a little more. Looks like we still need to come more towards the front. Or just a smidge too high there. We're kind of touching, so we're just gonna let off a little bit of pressure, lower it down. Keep shimmying it until we get those components to line up. And that looks pretty close right there. We are gonna have to kind of pry out on our leaf spring there just a little bit, looks like, to get it to kind of line up. So now we're just gonna keep heading up. Looks like we still need to come out just a little bit more. Once you got it lined up, we're just going to jack it up, and we need to make sure that that bolt hole drops down inside of that hole on our leaf spring mount right there. You should have the leaf spring flush right on top of the bracket. So now we'll put our bracket in place. The center hole there will line up with the little peg on top of your leaf spring. Now you'll also notice here that you've got this ear that hangs off right here. We need our two holes here to be flat this way, so that way when you were to put bolts in, you would be putting them towards the inside of the trailer. You'll have different angles on these, whether they angle towards the rear or towards the front, because they do vary on which one you're going to put into place. For our front axle, we want it to angle towards the rear. For the middle axle, we want it to angle towards the rear. But for our rear axle, we want it to angle towards the front. And so that one will actually be different. This piece here would just be welded exactly the opposite angling that way. This is going to sit in place right here on top of our leaf spring stack. We'll take our U-bolt, slide it around the axle, go up into the bracket, and then we'll place our hardware back in on our U-bolts. So if you had washers, make sure you reuse those, and we'll get our nut in place as well. And we'll just put our U-bolt on the other side of the bracket, slide it through, and get it attached just like this one. And then we're just going to tighten these down and torque them to the manufacturer's specifications. You'll find a chart in your instructions that has typical U-bolt manufacturer specifications in it. Then we're just going to go back and torque these. When you torque them down, we do want to make sure we kind of go back and forth between our U-bolt, so that way it torques it down evenly and we have roughly the same amount of thread sticking out of each of the nuts on our U-bolt there. Now we're underneath our trailer. We're going to start attaching the shock absorbers that come in our kit. You are going to get some extra brackets in your kit because you get the bracketry to attach it to your frame here on the bottom, but we don't need that bracketry because it's integrated into our slipper spring box here. So you will have about 4 extra brackets you won't use if you got the full slipper spring setup. Those are only if you're just adding shocks without it. We'll now take the extension bracket that's this here. You can see we've got 4 holes in it, and there is a single hole here that's got a larger spacing than the other 3. That's our lower hole. So we're going to take our bracket. It's going to line up with the 2 slots here. We're going to have an upper and a lower position. For this trailer, we're going to use it in the lower position to drop it down further. So we're going to set it just like this. We're going to drop both the shorter bolts that come in our kit into there, and then we're going to thread the nylon locking nuts on the other side. Now these nylon locking nuts, these are the taller ones that come in your kit. The slightly shorter ones are going to be for your metric bolts. Those are the ones that we'll use to attach the shocks. They look very similar and they're similar size, but they have a different thread pitch. So we're just going to put those on there just like that. We're going to grab a 19mm socket and wrench and snug those down. Then we're going to grab our shock absorber and some hardware for those. Here's the lower set of hardware we're going to need here. So this is that shorter bolt that I was talking, or the shorter nut I was talking about. You can see it's not as tall, but a very similar size. So we're just going to move that off. We're going to start with the metric bolt, long bolt there. Slide on a washer. You can tell it's a metric bolt by the grade on it, 8.8. Your standards will have dashes. Now we got our washer on, we're going to flip it around here. We're going to go from the outside of our trailer towards the inside, slide that bolt through the lower hole in our bracket. We'll slide a spacer into place, then we're going to take the lower slot on our shock and put that in. We know we have the lower if our letters are upside down here and it's just kind of hanging down. This is also the smaller portion that slides into the upper portion, so it slides into that upper portion. We'll then follow that up with another flat washer and a nylon locking nut. We want to go ahead and leave these loose at this time. And then we're going to grab our hardware for the upper attachment. It's basically the same hardware except for we have these 2 wedge washers that we're also going to be using to compensate for the angle that we've got here. So we're going to go ahead and undo this real quick. We're going to start with a washer on it once again. Go ahead and kind of flip this guy around. We're going to slide our bolt through our shock. Following the bolt, we're going to place a spacer on it. After our spacer, we are going to place one of the wedge-shaped washers. At this point now, we're going to slide it through the hole in our assembly here. Now it's not uncommon when you go to slide this in that it doesn't quite line up perfectly. It should be pretty close, but you might have to extend it or push it in just a little bit. Usually we have to extend it just a smidge to get it to go into place. To do this, we're going to pull our strap off here. Now as soon as you pull this off, the shock is going to want to expand. It's not excessively strong. You should be able to overpower it, but just keep that in mind. It is going to want to start to move on you. So, and then as it's expanding, we can
line it up or push it together, whatever we need to do to get it to go through the hole. So that's pretty close. At this point, we're gonna take that wedge washer, we're gonna slide it around, try to get our wrench in here to hold the nut. And then if I can, I like to take another finger and just kind of help hold that washer in place as I finish tightening it down here. And there we go. That's exactly what we want to see. We've got the small wedge angled towards our shock on the inside portion here, and then on the outside of our slipper box towards the inside of our trailer, we've got the larger one down there. So we're going to repeat this same process now. For the rest of them, we can go ahead and torque these down as well to the manufacturer's specifications, but it's going to be the same for our middle one here. The only difference is the middle one is going to angle from the front towards the rear. The angle just changes because the angle is always going to be towards the kind of slipper portion of it. Our front one's also going to angle from the front towards the back. So this is the only one that's going to angle from the back towards the front. So now that we've got this side completed, we'll perform the exact same steps over on the other side to get that side installed. Now that we've got everything tightened and torqued, at this point it's just putting our wheels back on, torquing them down, and then we're ready to hit the road. And that completes our installation of Roadmaster's Comfort Ride slipper spring system for triple axles on our 2015 Grand Design Momentum.